There is a number that does not get talked about enough in general aviation circles, and it is this: the Aircraft Owners and Pilots Association, the largest general aviation organization in the world, the one that has been the political and cultural backbone of private flying in America for decades, has lost roughly 30% of its membership since 2005. Not 30% of a small baseline, 30% of what was, at its peak, an organization that had somewhere in the neighborhood of 400,000 members, at a time when general aviation in this country still felt like it had real momentum underneath it. That is not a rounding error. That is not a blip caused by a bad year or a dues increase. That is a structural, sustained, 20-year decline that has happened across economic expansions, across periods when new airplane sales were strong, across years when the airshow circuit was packed and aviation content was everywhere, and everyone in the industry kept talking about a renaissance just around the corner. The decline kept happening anyway, quietly, year after year, beneath all of that noise, and the gap between the story the industry tells about itself and what the membership rolls actually reflect has grown wide enough that you cannot ignore it anymore without working hard at it. Today I want to walk you through what this collapse actually looks like when you get underneath the surface level numbers. Not just the head count, but the demographics driving it, the economics behind it, the cultural shifts underneath it, and why the solutions that get proposed again and again inside the aviation community keep missing the actual problem. Because the real story here is not about AOPA specifically. AOPA is just the most visible, most quantifiable evidence of something much bigger happening to the pilot population in this country. And if you want to understand where general aviation is actually headed, this breakdown is exactly the place to start. Before we get into it, hit subscribe, because this is the kind of structural, long-form analysis of general aviation economics and demographics that most aviation coverage simply does not do. And if you want to understand this industry at the level where the actual decisions and trends are happening, rather than at the airshow booth level, you do not want to miss what is coming next. Let us start with the raw numbers, because you need to understand the scope of what we are actually looking at before any of the individual pieces of the story make sense. AOPA's membership peaked somewhere around the turn of the millennium and into the early 2000s, at figures that were genuinely impressive for a niche hobby and transportation organization. Depending on which year you pick as your baseline, you are looking at peak membership figures somewhere in the range of 400,000 to 415,000 members. By the time you get to the mid-2000s, that number starts softening. By the early 2010s, the decline is consistent enough that it stops looking like a trend and starts looking like a trajectory. By the most recent figures that have been discussed publicly, total membership has settled somewhere in the neighborhood of 275,000 to 285,000, with some estimates suggesting it has dipped below that, depending on how you count lapsed members and how aggressively renewal campaigns have been running. That is a loss of somewhere between 125,000 and 140,000 members over roughly 2 decades. Real people, real pilots, real aviation participants, who were either in the organization and left, or who aged out, or who quit flying altogether and never came back, or who represent new pilots who never joined in the first place, despite being the exact demographic that membership recruitment campaigns have been chasing for years. Each one of those outcomes, the people who left, the people who aged out, the people who quit flying, and the new pilots who never joined, tells a different part of the story. And understanding those 4 separate exit doors is really the key to understanding why the headline number looks the way it does, and more importantly, why it is unlikely to reverse without something changing at a more fundamental level than any single membership campaign can reach. Let us start with the demographic piece, because it is the most structural and the hardest to fix quickly, and it underpins everything else we are going to talk about. The certified pilot population in the United States has an age distribution problem that would be deeply alarming in almost any other industry. The average age of an active general aviation pilot in this country has been climbing steadily for decades. There are different ways to measure this depending on whether you look at medical certificate holders, student starts, or active registered pilots. But across all of those measures, the direction is the same. The pilot population is getting older, faster than new pilots are entering to replace the ones aging out of the activity. FAA data on medical certificates tells part of this story clearly. Third-class medical holders, the ones most associated with recreational and personal flying rather than commercial operations, have been declining in number for years. But more importantly, the age distribution within that population has shifted so dramatically that the average active private pilot is now well into their 50s. That is not a minor quirk. That is a structural reality that means a meaningful portion of the active pilot population is within 10 to 15 years of the age at which insurance gets restrictive, medicals get complicated, and the physical demands of single pilot operations start pushing people toward the hangar door for the last time. What this means for an organization like AOPA is not subtle. When your membership base ages faster than it replenishes, you have a mathematical problem that no amount of better marketing or more compelling member benefits can fully offset. The people leaving the membership rolls through aging out, through medical disqualification, through retirement from flying, through death, are leaving at a rate that has consistently exceeded the rate at which new pilots are joining the organization and staying with it through the critical early years of their flying careers. And that gap between exits and entries is exactly what a 30% decline over 20 years looks like in practice. Here is where it gets more specific and more sobering. The peak flying years, in terms of hours flown and activity level, tend to cluster in a range from roughly the late 30s to the mid-50s for most recreational and personal use pilots. That is the window when someone typically has enough disposable income to fly regularly, enough time established in their career that they are not grinding through early career financial pressure, and enough runway ahead of them physically that they are investing in the activity rather than winding it down. That demographic window, the pilot in their 40s who is actively flying, paying hangar rent, buying avionics upgrades, renewing their membership every year without much thought because aviation is genuinely central to their life, that cohort has been thinning. The generation that filled that window through the 1980s, 90s, and early 2000s came out of a very specific cultural moment for aviation in America. The post-war expansion of general aviation, the training pipeline that came out of military aviation through Korea and Vietnam, the cultural cachet that flying carried, through a period when it was aspirational and achievable for a growing middle class. The era when a reasonably successful small business owner or professional could actually afford to buy and maintain a used Bonanza or a Cherokee without it being a significant financial stretch relative to their income. All of that created a cohort of pilots that was unusually large, unusually active, and unusually durable as a membership base. That cohort is now aging out of peak flying years. Some of them are still flying. A meaningful number have already stopped or significantly reduced their activity. And the generation behind them, the one that should have been entering that same 40 to 55 sweet spot and sustaining the numbers, simply did not learn to fly in the same proportions. Why not? That is a question that deserves more than a simple answer, because it has several layers, and each layer has been used at different times as the explanation for the pipeline problem, when really, they are all true simultaneously and interact with each other in ways that make the whole problem harder to address than any single cause would be. The cost layer is the most obvious and the most frequently cited, and it is real. The cost of learning to fly in the United States has increased so dramatically over the last 2 decades that it has moved from a stretch goal for a reasonably ambitious middle-class person to something that genuinely requires upper-middle-class income just to get through a private certificate without financial stress. When someone in the early 2000s was completing a private certificate at a cost that, adjusting for inflation to today's dollars, would be somewhere in the range of $8,000 to $12,000, it was accessible to a wide enough income bracket that a genuine mass market for pilot training existed. The same certificate today, at a flight school charging current rates for an aircraft that now costs the school far more to own, insure, and maintain, and with instructor time priced accordingly, commonly runs somewhere between $15,000 and $25,000 before the ink is dry, and that is if everything goes reasonably smoothly, without significant weather delays or scheduling gaps. In major metro areas, and at busy flight schools with newer fleets, the number can push past $30,000 without any particular extravagance. That cost increase did not happen because anyone in the industry decided to make flight training unaffordable. It happened because of the compounding of several genuinely real cost pressures: aircraft acquisition and maintenance costs, insurance for training operations, which has increased dramatically, the labor market for flight instructors, which has been distorted by regional airline hiring pipelines pulling qualified instructors away before they accumulate the kind of instructional experience that makes them genuinely excellent teachers, and avgas prices that have moved with broader energy markets in ways that small flight schools cannot hedge against the way large operators can. Every one of those cost pressures is real and legitimate. The cumulative effect of all of them together is an activity that has priced itself out of the demographic range that would otherwise replenish it. Now layer on top of that cost barrier the time commitment, which is the second layer of the pipeline problem and probably the more underappreciated one. Getting a private pilot certificate requires a minimum of 40 hours of flight time, and the national average is closer to 65 to 70 hours when you account for real-world students with real-world scheduling constraints, weather interruptions, lesson gaps, and the completely normal reality that learning to fly takes most people longer than the regulatory minimum. Those 65 hours need to happen over a period of months, which means consistent access to a flight school, consistent availability in a student's schedule, the financial ability to keep paying for lessons without a significant gap that causes skill regression and adds hours to the total, and a geographic situation where a general aviation airport with an operating flight school is realistically accessible. That combination of cost, time, geographic access, and scheduling consistency maps onto a pretty specific socioeconomic profile. And that profile has been getting narrower as housing costs in metro areas have pushed people away from the suburban and exurban locations where general aviation airports have historically been most accessible. The flight school that used to be 15 minutes from where a professional family lived is now 45 minutes away because that family can no longer afford housing in the neighborhood near the airport, or because the airport is facing land use pressure and development encroachment that has been a steady pressure across the American GA airport network for decades. This is where the demographic collapse starts to look less like a simple trend and more like a system that has multiple failure modes reinforcing each other. High training costs reduce the number of people who start. Long training timelines and scheduling difficulty increase the number who start but do not finish. Geographic displacement from airport access reduces the pool who can realistically train at all. And then, once you do get a certificate, the cost of actually exercising that certificate, renting an airplane, joining a flying club, eventually buying, maintaining, and insuring your own aircraft, immediately confronts you with another set of numbers that look very different from what they looked like a generation ago when the pilot cohort that built AOPA's membership peak was getting started. Let us talk about that post-certificate retention problem, because it is genuinely separate from the training pipeline issue, and it is doing its own damage to membership numbers in ways that rarely get discussed with the attention they deserve. The dirty secret of general aviation demographics is that a significant number of people who successfully complete a private certificate do not remain active pilots. The FAA counts certificate holders, but certificate holders and active pilots are meaningfully different populations, and the gap between them has been growing. There is a large and well-documented phenomenon of pilots who get their certificate, fly for a year or two, and then gradually or abruptly stop flying, as the economic and logistical reality of maintaining currency and proficiency in the post-certificate phase collides with everything else competing for their time and money. Think about what keeps a newly certificated pilot flying. They need access to an aircraft, either through ownership, co-ownership, a flying club, or rental. Rental availability at many airports has actually decreased as flight schools that used to maintain rental fleets have pulled back from that side of the business or gone out of business entirely. Flying clubs are genuinely excellent solutions to the access problem, but they require a critical mass of engaged members to function, and in areas where the pilot population is aging and thinning, clubs that used to have 30 or 40 active members are running with 12 or 15, and some have dissolved entirely. If a new pilot wants to own, they immediately confront an aircraft market where even a basic, older, unimproved 4-seat single is commanding prices that reflect both genuine appreciation in the value of used GA aircraft and the scarcity of appropriate entry-level inventory. A first-time buyer looking for a clean, affordable, simple airplane to build hours and confidence is competing against a buyer pool where the organic supply of truly affordable aircraft has been shrinking for years, partly because older aircraft that used to be entry-level options have been absorbed into training fleets, partly because the pipeline of lower-priced aircraft from estate sales and forced sellers has been thinner than in previous decades, and partly because even the cost of making an older airplane airworthy and well-maintained has increased to a point where the real cost of ownership is genuinely higher than it appears from the purchase price. So a new pilot who is enthusiastic, who really does want to keep flying, who did not get their certificate just to hang it on the wall, looks at the post-certificate landscape and finds the path forward significantly harder to navigate than it looked from inside the training pipeline. Some of them push through and build a sustainable flying life. But the attrition rate in that first 2 to 3 years post-certificate is genuinely alarming, and every pilot who drops out during that window is a membership candidate who will never show up in AOPA's recruitment pipeline in any sustained way. Here is the generational piece of this that makes everything else sharper. The cultural relationship that different generations have with aviation as an aspiration is genuinely different from what it was when the pilot population was being built in the decades after World War II, and pretending otherwise gets in the way of understanding what is actually happening. General aviation in its peak era had a specific kind of aspirational meaning that connected to its historical moment. Flying your own airplane was, for the generation that came of age in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, one of the most tangible and visible expressions of upward mobility, personal freedom, and technological optimism that American post-war culture produced. It was attainable enough that it felt like a real goal rather than a fantasy, and the cultural signals around it, the movies, the advertising, the business culture, the idea of the successful executive who flies his own airplane to his own vacation cabin, created a genuine aspirational pipeline that fed into pilot training numbers in a way that had nothing to do with the purely rational cost-benefit analysis of flying as transportation. That aspirational context does not exist in the same form for younger generations of potential pilots today. This is not an attack on anyone's character or ambition. It is a cultural and historical reality. The generation that is now in its mid-20s to late 30s, which is the cohort that general aviation desperately needs to recruit into flying in order to sustain the activity and the organizations built around it, grew up in a world where aviation's aspirational meaning has been substantially competed for and diluted by other expressions of success, freedom, and technological engagement that did not exist in the same way for earlier generations. The person who in 1965 might have channeled their aspiration for freedom and mobility into learning to fly is in 2024 potentially channeling it into overlanding, into sailing, into motorcycle touring, into a dozen other pursuits that have built robust, well-marketed communities around themselves and that carry similar emotional weight at a different price point and accessibility level. This is not to say that aviation lacks appeal for younger potential pilots. It is absolutely wrong to conclude that nobody in their 30s is interested in flying. But the proportion of that generation that arrives at aviation as their aspirational activity of choice relative to the full range of competitors for their time, money, and identity investment is smaller than it was for the generation that built the membership numbers AOPA is now defending the decline from. And that difference in proportion, played out across the full size of the potential pilot population, produces a smaller training pipeline, a thinner membership base, and a structural headcount problem that looks exactly like what the numbers actually show. There is a technology dimension to this that the aviation community often tells itself is the solution when it is actually more complicated than that. The argument goes, younger generations are technology-oriented, modern avionics are more accessible and less intimidating than they used to be, glass cockpits democratize situational awareness, and the iPad on the kneeboard has lowered the barrier to navigation and weather decision-making in ways that should make the activity more appealing to people who are comfortable with technology. All of that is true. The technological accessibility of modern flying has genuinely improved in ways that make certain aspects of the learning curve less steep than they used to be. But technology orientation does not automatically translate into pilot recruitment the way the industry sometimes hopes, because the technology of modern flying is still embedded in the physical, logistical, financial, and time commitment structure of getting a certificate and staying current. And those structural barriers exist completely independently of whether the avionics suite is approachable or intimidating. A 28-year-old who is entirely comfortable with touchscreen navigation and electronic flight bags still has to find $12,000 for the first half of their training, still has to get to an airport consistently over several months, still has to deal with an aviation medical certificate system that has its own bureaucratic friction, and still has to face the post-certificate economic reality of actually maintaining an active flying life. Technology making the cockpit more intuitive does not address any of those structural problems in any direct way. The medical certificate issue deserves its own extended treatment because it sits at the intersection of the training pipeline problem, the post-certificate retention problem, and the aging demographic problem simultaneously, and it has been one of the most contentious policy issues in general aviation for decades for exactly that reason. The FAA's medical certification system for private pilots flying under traditional rules has been, for a very long time, a barrier that operates differently at different stages of a flying career. For a healthy 30-year-old learning to fly for the first time, the third-class medical is typically a non-event, a formality that takes an hour with an aviation medical examiner and produces a piece of paper good for several years. For a 55-year-old who has developed any of the extremely common age-related health conditions that American adults commonly develop by that stage of life, the same system becomes a source of genuine anxiety and uncertainty. Hypertension, cardiac history, type 2 diabetes management, depression or anxiety treated with certain medications, sleep apnea, all of these conditions that are genuinely common among the exact demographic that represents the largest share of active GA pilots, have historically intersected with the medical certification process in ways that added stress, cost, and sometimes unpleasant surprises to what should be a routine flying life. The introduction of Basic Med in 2017 was a meaningful step toward addressing some of this, and it did genuinely help a segment of the pilot population that was at risk of losing their flying privileges to medical bureaucracy rather than actual incapacity. Under Basic Med, a pilot who meets certain conditions and flies a certain category of aircraft can maintain flying privileges through a relationship with their personal physician rather than through the full FAA medical examination process, which reduces both the cost and the anxiety associated with the medical side of maintaining currency. But Basic Med did not eliminate the medical barrier to flying, and it introduced its own layer of nuance that not everyone in the pilot population is fully comfortable navigating. The conditions under which Basic Med applies, the aircraft categories it covers, the restrictions on operations it does not cover, all require a degree of regulatory literacy that some pilots are genuinely uncertain about, particularly older pilots who did not grow up with the internet as a primary resource for regulatory research, and who may be getting information about Basic Med from other pilots rather than from authoritative sources. The fear of inadvertently operating outside the bounds of one's medical authorization is real among that demographic, and that fear, even when it does not reflect the actual regulatory situation, contributes to pilots choosing to stop flying rather than navigate what feels like uncertain territory. The pilots who stopped flying over medical certificate concerns, whether because of actual disqualifying conditions, because of fear of the examination process uncovering something that would lead to disqualification, or because of uncertainty about Basic Med, represent a real but essentially invisible attrition stream in the membership numbers. These are people who wanted to keep flying, who had the financial means and the motivation, but who hit a medical barrier or a perceived barrier and exited the active pilot population without necessarily making much noise about it. They simply did not renew their medical, did not join the flying club, stopped maintaining currency, and eventually let their AOPA membership lapse because the central thing that membership was organized around no longer applied to their daily life. Now let us talk about the financial demography of this, because it intersects with everything else, and it is maybe the most underappreciated dimension of why the membership numbers look the way they do. General aviation has always been disproportionately upper income as a hobby and transportation mode. That is not a new observation, but the relationship between income distribution in the United States and the GA pilot population has shifted in ways that are structural and meaningful. The middle-income professional who could afford to participate in flying meaningfully in the 1970s and 80s, not as a luxury indulgence but as a genuine part of their lifestyle, has faced a set of economic pressures over the last 30 years that have made that participation harder to sustain across a wider range of income levels. The real costs of aviation, aircraft ownership, maintenance, insurance, avionics upgrades, hangar rent, fuel, training and recurrency, have increased faster than inflation for the middle of the income distribution, in ways that have effectively pushed meaningful participation in flying further up the income scale than it used to sit. What this means in practical terms is that the recreational and personal use pilot population has become more concentrated at the high end of the income distribution relative to where it used to be distributed. That is not necessarily visible in the faces you see at a fly-in or in the demographics that aviation companies target in their advertising, because the pilots who are still active tend to be the ones with the economic resources to sustain the activity at current costs. But it is visible in the aggregate numbers, because the middle-income pilot who used to be a reliable long-term AOPA member is less likely to enter the pipeline in the first place, and less likely to stay in the activity long enough to become a durable member when they do. This concentration of aviation at the upper end of the income distribution has an interesting secondary effect that does not often get discussed. The pilots who remain most active and most economically engaged with the industry are increasingly concentrated in categories of use and aircraft ownership that look quite different from the base case that built the membership in earlier decades. We are talking about owners of higher performance singles, cabin class twins, turboprops, light jets, people who are using aviation primarily as a genuine transportation tool for their businesses, and who have the economic resources to absorb the full cost of that without significant lifestyle strain. That is a very different pilot than the Saturday afternoon flyer who rented a 172 at the local FBO and flew to a nearby airport for a $100 hamburger, and the organization and the culture built around that Saturday flyer have had to adapt to serving a progressively smaller and more affluent active member base, while somehow simultaneously recruiting new pilots from a generation that finds the financial barriers very real. There is a geographic dimension to this that is worth mapping out explicitly, because the uneven distribution of the pilot population across American geography is part of why certain regions feel like the decline is much sharper than the national numbers suggest. The contraction of the pilot population has not happened evenly across the country. It has been concentrated in specific ways that follow the broader patterns of rural depopulation, the decline of small-town general aviation infrastructure, and the economic pressures that have hit small and mid-size markets differently than major metro areas. Small airports in rural regions, the ones that served as the backbone of the recreational flying network in an earlier era, and that were genuinely central to the local social and economic life of those communities, have experienced the loss of flight schools, the loss of FBOs, the loss of fuel service, and in some cases, the loss of the airport itself. Not because of regulatory action, but because the economic activity that justified the infrastructure simply contracted below the threshold needed to sustain it. When a rural airport loses its flight school, the effect on pilot production in that region does not appear immediately in national statistics. It appears years later when the cohort of young people from that area who might have been exposed to aviation and gotten their certificate does not show up in the pilot population because the on-ramp to the activity that used to exist in their community simply is not there anymore. That attrition in the pipeline is invisible and slow-moving in a way that makes it particularly hard to address, because by the time it shows up in the membership numbers and the FAA certification statistics, it has already been happening for years. The counter-argument to all of this, and it gets made persistently within the aviation community, is that the pilot population and the GA industry are actually healthier than the membership numbers suggest, that the decline in AOPA membership specifically reflects something about membership value and competitive alternatives rather than a genuine decline in the pilot population, and that activity levels and flight hours tell a more optimistic story than headcount does. There is something real in this argument, and it is worth taking seriously rather than dismissing. It is true that AOPA membership is a lagging and imperfect indicator of pilot population health. People can be active pilots without being AOPA members. The growth of EAA chapters, of type clubs, of online aviation communities built around specific aircraft types or flying styles means that pilots have more options for how they engage organizationally with their flying than they did in an era when AOPA was the primary institutional expression of general aviation community. Some of the membership decline likely does reflect genuine competition from alternative forms of aviation community rather than pure attrition from the pilot population itself. But the argument that the numbers are misleading because of organizational competition only goes so far. The total certified pilot population has been declining at the FAA Level 2. Student certificate starts, which are the leading indicator for future pilot population size, have been inconsistent and have not produced the sustained growth in active certificated pilots that would be needed to offset the aging wave working its way through the existing population. The private pilot certificate population specifically has been essentially flat to down for years when measured against the growth of the general population, which means the market penetration of flying as an activity has been contracting, not just the particular organizational wrapper around it. The most intellectually honest position is that both things are true simultaneously. There is some real, genuine substitution happening at the organizational level as pilots engage with aviation community in more fragmented and specialized ways, rather than through a single large umbrella organization. And there is also a genuine demographic contraction in the pilot population itself, driven by the aging of the peak cohort, the cost and access barriers to new pilot entry, the post-certificate attrition problem, and the shifting cultural landscape for aviation as an aspirational activity. Both of those forces are working against AOPA's membership numbers, and they are doing it at the same time, and separating them cleanly is genuinely difficult, which is partly why the responses to the membership decline have sometimes talked past the actual problem. Let us talk about what the aviation industry and advocacy community have actually tried in response to this, because the attempts are instructive about how difficult it is to address a structural demographic problem with programmatic interventions. The push for third-class medical reform, culminating in Basic Med, was a real and meaningful advocacy win that helped real pilots. The expansion of sport pilot privileges through the Mosaic rulemaking is similarly a genuine structural improvement that expands access. The FAA Wings program, the many industry-led initiatives to reduce training costs and improve completion rates, the numerous Young Eagles and introductory flight programs at the grassroots level, all represent genuine effort and genuine belief that the pipeline can be rebuilt if the right combination of access improvements, cost reductions, and outreach strategies can be found. These efforts are not wasted. Young Eagles programs have exposed genuinely enormous numbers of young people to flying, and some of them do go on to pursue certificates. Basic Med has kept real pilots flying who might have otherwise stopped. Cost and access improvements, wherever they have happened, have made the activity more available to a broader economic range of potential participants. But the scale of the interventions being discussed and implemented does not match the scale of the structural forces driving the decline. Introducing a young person to flying through a discovery flight is meaningfully different from creating a clear and economically accessible path from that discovery flight to a certificate and an active flying life. The gap between those two things is where most of the attrition actually happens, and it is a gap filled with the real costs of training, the real difficulty of sustaining consistent scheduling over months, the real challenge of finding accessible aircraft after the certificate is in hand, and the real economic pressure of actually owning or regularly renting in a market where costs have moved significantly upward. The challenge for an organization like AOPA in this environment is genuinely complicated. The organization was built on the needs, interests, and political power of a large, active, demographically stable pilot population that had specific advocacy priorities around airspace access, medical reform, fuel availability, and regulatory burden. It remains an extremely effective advocacy organization by the standards of any industry group, and the policy wins it has contributed to over the decades are real and matter to the flying public. But advocacy effectiveness at the political level does not automatically translate into membership recruitment effectiveness at the individual level, and the services and benefits that made AOPA membership feel essential to a pilot in 1995 look somewhat different in the context of what a pilot in 2024 actually needs and how they get it. A pilot who trained in the 90s or early 2000s and was building their flying life in a period when ATATA was the primary source of medical reform information, the primary source of quality aviation legal services, the primary source of organized political voice on regulatory issues, and one of the very few sources of high-quality aviation news and analysis, had a clear and compelling reason to be a member. A pilot training today is navigating all of those same needs through a much more fragmented information and service landscape, where medical information is available from multiple competing sources, including the internet and social media, where type clubs and online communities provide peer support and technical information, where aviation news is available from dozens of channels competing for the same audience. The value proposition of a single comprehensive membership has to work harder to be compelling to a pilot who has more alternatives than their predecessor did. This is not an indictment of AOPA's execution. It is a structural challenge that any large membership organization faces when the information landscape that originally justified centralized membership gets disrupted by alternatives. And it is a challenge that is separate from and additional to the underlying demographic problem of having fewer new pilots entering the activity. There is a pattern in how organizations respond to this kind of dual pressure, and it is worth naming because it is relevant to understanding what comes next. The first instinct when membership declines is to look for ways to improve the membership proposition, add benefits, reduce dues friction, build better digital tools, create more compelling content. All of those things are worth doing, but they operate primarily on the margins, affecting the decision of pilots who are on the fence about whether to join or renew. They do not address the structural fact that the pool of potential pilots is smaller than it used to be, that the path from potential pilot to active certificated member is harder to walk than it used to be, and that even pilots who are active face a membership value proposition that has to compete in a much noisier information environment. The organizations and communities in aviation that are growing, or at least not declining at the same rate, are almost exclusively the ones that are doing something structural about the access and cost barriers, rather than the ones that are primarily focused on making the membership proposition more attractive. Flying clubs that reduce per-hour costs through shared ownership are growing where they are being organized effectively. LSA and now Mosaic-eligible aircraft that expand what a sport pilot can fly are opening up a different cost and access structure than the traditional certificated aircraft path. Simplified aircraft ownership models, co-ownership platforms, more accessible insurance products for newer pilots. All of these are chipping at the structural barriers in ways that create a more realistic path, from interest to active participation. The demographic math is not going to reverse quickly, regardless of what gets done in the near term. The aging wave in the current pilot population is too large and too advanced to be fully offset by any realistic increase in new pilot entry rates over the next 5 to 10 years. The pilots who are going to age out of active flying over the next decade are already in the pipeline, and there is no intervention that changes that. The question is what the population looks like 15 to 20 years from now, and whether the structural improvements being made today in cost, access, medical, and aircraft availability are sufficient to build a replenishment rate that actually stops the decline and begins a recovery, or whether the decline continues at a rate similar to the last 2 decades until it reaches a new, lower equilibrium built around a smaller, more concentrated, more affluent pilot population. The equilibrium scenario is not a disaster scenario in the narrow sense. Aviation will not disappear. The industry will not cease to function. But it will be a fundamentally different industry from the one that was imagined when organizations like AOPA were built. An industry serving a smaller, older, more economically selective population, rather than a broad cross-section of the ambitious middle class that formed the cultural and political base of general aviation in its peak decades. And the advocacy power, cultural influence, and policy effectiveness of the organizations built around that broader base will be proportionally different in a world where the membership base has contracted to a fraction of its former scale. There is a financial and political consequence to that contraction that is worth spelling out explicitly because it is often left implicit. AOPA's advocacy effectiveness at the regulatory and congressional level is at least partly a function of the size and geographic distribution of its membership. A 400,000 member organization with members in every congressional district in the country has a different kind of political presence than a 280,000 member organization with a more geographically concentrated and demographically skewed member base. That difference is not fatal to advocacy effectiveness, but it is real. And it means that the arguments for preserving general aviation infrastructure, airport access, airspace, and regulatory reasonableness have to be made more efficiently and with a smaller army than they used to be. There is also a financial dimension that is simple arithmetic. The operational budget of an organization scales with membership, and maintaining the full scope of services, publications, legal services, advocacy staff, airman protection programs, and member benefits at the quality level that the membership expects is genuinely harder with 125,000 fewer members paying dues than it was at peak. Organizations in this situation face a hard set of choices about which services to sustain at full quality, which to reduce, and how to find alternative revenue streams that reduce dependence on the per-member dues model. Those choices are not dramatic, and they mostly happen quietly, but they accumulate over time into an organization that looks and functions somewhat differently from the one its members originally joined, and that difference can itself accelerate membership departure among members who notice the change and reassess whether the value is still there. The most honest summary of where this all points is also the least comfortable one. The 30% membership decline since 2005 is not an organization failing at its mission. It is an organization accurately reflecting the demographic reality of the activity it represents. The pilot population it serves is genuinely smaller and older than it was 20 years ago. The pipeline that would replenish it is genuinely constrained by costs, access barriers, cultural competition, and post-certificate attrition. The advocacy and service landscape it operates in has genuinely fragmented in ways that make the single large membership organization model work harder to justify itself. And the economic forces that created general aviation's golden era in terms of accessible participation by a broad demographic range are genuinely different today from what they were when the peak membership numbers were built. That does not mean the decline continues indefinitely at the same rate. There are genuine countervailing forces. Mosaic and expanded sport pilot privileges represent a structural improvement in access that is real and meaningful. Basic med preserved active flying for a segment of the population that might otherwise have been forced out. Electric aircraft, whatever their current limitations, represent a long-term technology trajectory that could eventually change the cost structure of flying in ways that make entry more accessible, if the infrastructure and certification picture matures. Type clubs and online communities are sustaining engagement with aviation among people who might not be active members of a traditional umbrella organization, but who are still flying, still buying airplanes, still paying attention to the advocacy issues that affect their flying life. But none of those countervailing forces are large enough or fast-moving enough to reverse the current trajectory in the near term, and understanding that is important for anyone who is trying to make real decisions about the future of general aviation institutions, businesses, or infrastructure. A flight school operator thinking about where demand for their services is headed, an airport authority trying to justify infrastructure investment based on projected activity levels, a manufacturer trying to model demand for new aircraft production runs, an insurance underwriter trying to price risk across an aging and contracting pilot population. All of these decisions get made better when they are informed by an honest reading of what the demographic trend actually is, rather than by the optimistic version that gets told at air shows. The 30% membership decline is not the story. The story is everything underneath it. The aging of a founding cohort, the failure to replace them at anywhere near the rate needed, the compounding of cost and access barriers that make entry harder, the post-certificate attrition that removes even successful new pilots from the active flying community, and the cultural and economic shifts that have changed general aviation from something accessible to a wide range of aspirational Americans into something concentrated among a narrower and more economically selective group. AOPA's membership numbers are just the most visible, most quantifiable evidence of all of that playing out in real time across a 20-year arc. If you are a pilot, this story matters to you whether you are a member of any organization or not, because the strength of the advocacy voice, the survival of the airport infrastructure, the financial health of the flight schools and FBOs that sustain your flying life, all of those things are downstream of whether the pilot population that generates demand for them and political weight behind them is growing, stable, or contracting. And right now, on the raw numbers, it is contracting, in ways that deserve honest attention rather than institutional optimism. If you are not yet a pilot but you have been thinking about it, understanding this landscape honestly is actually more useful than the boosterism you sometimes get from people inside the industry who have obvious reasons to want you to see things in the most favorable possible light. The barriers are real. The costs are real. The post-certificate challenge of building an affordable and sustainable flying life is real. None of that means you should not pursue it if it genuinely calls to you, but it means you should go in with your eyes open about what the path actually looks like, rather than what the marketing materials suggest. And if you are someone who is thinking about general aviation as a business, an investment, or a policy priority, the demographic data is telling you something important about where the trajectory is pointed, and what it would actually take to change that trajectory meaningfully, rather than marginally. The interventions that work at the margins are not the same as the interventions that change structural trends, and knowing the difference between those two categories of response is the beginning of any serious engagement with where this industry is actually going. Let me know in the comments where you see this going, whether you are an active pilot watching these trends from inside the community, or whether you are someone who considered getting into flying and found the barriers real enough to push you in a different direction. The ground-level experiences from people actually navigating this landscape are more informative than any aggregate statistic can fully capture, and understanding the full range of how this plays out for individual people is the only way to get a genuinely complete picture of what the 30% decline actually represents in human terms, not just institutional headcount. Hit subscribe if this kind of structural look at